Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to MGH Palliative Care and Geriatrics Grand Rounds. I am pleased to introduce Peter Butzen, a PENP Fellow. A little bit about Pete. After completing his undergraduate degree in public relations, Peter spent time abroad with the U.S. Peace Corps, first working with farmers and students in rural Uganda, and later at a pediatric HIV clinic in Botswana with Baylor's International Pediatric AIDS Initiative. His experience working abroad with youth ignited a passion for providing support to children and adolescents, especially those living with complex medical conditions, as well as their families. Following his time abroad, Peter returned stateside to pursue a Master's of Science in Nursing at Yale. Since becoming a pediatric nurse practitioner, Peter's experiences with patients with complex medical needs and their families have guided him towards the field of pediatric palliative care. I'm pleased to introduce Pete.
Thank you, Suni. Thank you all for having me here and for being here or listening from afar, wherever you might be. I'm going to try to do a double click thing today, so we'll see how this goes. First of all, I have to say that this is an absolute honor to be here, especially standing before this group in particular. It's also admittedly a little bit intimidating. Let's see, I feel a little bit like I'm like a new chef about to cook for Gordon Ramsay.
So useful.
I'm not quite there, but as I share what I've learned and some of my experiences with my time as a palliative care provider, I hope that today we offer some insight, maybe some intrigue, and at the very least, some food for thought. I have no disclosures, financial, otherwise. So I'd like to present today a presentation titled, When Terminal Extubation Isn't Terminal, Lessons from an Acute Change in Goals of Care. Or, The Unexpected Beauty of a Deconstructed Longitudinal Relationship. So our objectives for today, don't want to give too much away, but I know some of you are this type that like to read the last chapter of the book first. So first, we are going to work on recognizing how longitudinal relationships can be pivotal in pediatric palliative care. Then we'll go ahead and review the care needs addressed over the length of a partnership between families and pediatric palliative care providers. And then finally, we want to define a term, regoaling, and identify the relationship between regoaling and longitudinal pediatric palliative care. I do want to say that I use the word pediatric quite often in my objectives here, is because I am pediatrics, but I'd love to hear kind of where this crosses over into the adult world as we talk a little bit later. Okay. So, why the emphasis on longitudinal relationships in pediatric palliative care? 2011 multi-center cohort study provides insight as to who pediatric palliative care patients are, and it also provides some motivation for being able to develop relationships over time. The prospective study by the Pediatric Palliative Care Research Network, published in Pediatrics, looked at 6 different hospitals and their pediatric palliative care programs, including, of course, Dana-Farber and Boston Children's PACT team, led by Dr. Joanne Wolf. This took place over 3 months in 2008. During that time, 515 pediatric patients were consulted on or received care, and within a 30-day period, or after a 30-day period, 88% of these patients were still living. The study also went ahead and followed up on the cohort 365 days later And as you can see, 76 and 74% of pediatric palliative care patients with neuromuscular disease and genetic disease, respectively, were still alive after 1 year following the initial consultation. Almost 50% of pediatric palliative care patients with cancer were still alive. And in total, about 70% of the 515 patients were still alive 1 year after the initial consult. So we can see that in pediatrics especially, many of the consults that we receive, the patients do tend to live for a longer period of time. So it's obviously important to figure out how to and why to develop longer relationships with these families. And it's also my understanding that this is continuing to increase. So we look at these numbers and we see all these patients who have been consulted with pediatric palliative care and they're living longer. And then the question is posed, how then will they and their families receive the quality support that they need? Well, the most direct approach is, as I alluded to continue to develop our longitudinal relationships as an investment in our patients' futures. Looking at some of the shared decision-making literature, we can highlight some goals of longitudinal relationship. In the research on shared decision-making and patient-provider relationships, published in 2018 Journal of American Board of Family Medicine, Antoinette Schoenthaler and her colleagues described the importance of familiarity. Long-standing relationships may increase the provider's familiarity with the patient's needs and values, signaling genuine care and concern by the provider and engendering patient trust. Trust is another goal of these longitudinal relationships. Mechanic and Meyer, in their article, Concepts of Trust Among Patients and with Serious Illness, stated that trust involves vulnerability, and people typically proceed cautiously when the possibilities of harm are significant. However, trust builds iteratively through experience. The third goal in developing the longitudinal relationship is mutual respect. Longitudinal relationships lend themselves to repeated opportunities for patients and providers to develop therapeutic alliance and thereby increase mutual understanding and respect for one another's experience, knowledge, and preferences. The hope is that in developing these relationships with the families, having this familiarity, this trust, this mutual respect, this will lead to fewer barriers in communication within the future. Of course, as we talk about the development of longitudinal relationships, an element of time must be considered. While not surprising, it is very important to recognize the fact that there's no set amount of time that says you were in a relationship and now it's a longitudinal relationship. Things have, grown over time. It's not the amount of days that you have or the visits that you have, but it's actually the period over which one is able to develop these key pieces of this therapeutic relationship. I think that this can be very personal and it can vary from patient to patient and family to family. For instance, I think that there are times when you might walk away from a very first consult, initial consult, feeling as though things have developed very, very rapidly. Other times, a patient or a family with whom you've interacted with dozens of times, you walk in and they ask you to introduce yourself. Perhaps the best way to consider how the element of time in longitudinal relationships relates to palliative care is to think about the two different models of palliative care. These models will no doubt be familiar to many of us. The first is titled here, OLD, and considered the traditional palliative care model. This suggests that palliative care team might be consulted only after most, if not all, of the curative measures have been exhausted. In his 2007 article, Collaborative Communication in Pediatric Palliative Care, Dr. Feutner notes that this model suggests that this life-prolonging care is somewhat mutually exclusive from palliative care, and there's this resulting abrupt transition. And this, of course, obstructs any sort of development of a longitudinal relationship. It doesn't necessarily deny it, but it makes it a little bit more difficult. An alternative to the traditional model is the early palliative care model. This illustration here suggests that a palliative care team become involved as early as even diagnoses and continue to build the relationship with their interaction with the patient throughout the patient's illness into and beyond death, and continuing working with the families in bereavement. This model allows definitely for a better kind of opening for the idea of a longitudinal relationship and the importance of it. However, taking at face value, just looking at the model, there can be some kind of divisive borders there, suggesting that perhaps palliative care is in competition with curative care, that filling the space, the palliative care fills the space left by the quote-unquote failed treatment options. While this model recognizes the longitudinal nature of palliative care, it neglects to exhibit how the interventions often come in waves. And based on patients' or families' unique needs and medical situations. To better illustrate this, let's take a brief look at the longitudinal relationship between one of our pediatric patients, JL, and the palliative care team here. After breaking down each of the interactions that we kind of talk about here, we can adjust the level of intervention on our model to show the ebbs and flows of our involvement over time. I will give you a heads up that I am not the best computer-aided drawer, so take it for what it's worth. All right, just a quick background. JL is a 16-year-old young man. He was born prematurely at 29 weeks. He has cerebral palsy, spastic quadriplegia, tracheomalacia, and he is assisted by a tracheostomy and ventilated at night. He has intestinal dysmotility and utilizes a G-tube, and he has significant dystonia. JL lives with his mother, who is his primary caretaker. He has two brothers at home and his father as well, who works full-time. He also has home nursing hours and home hospital school 3 days a week. The pediatric palliative care team was first consulted on JL in May 2017, asking to have discussions around goals of care. So, on initial meeting, JL's mother, who shared that she understands that JL may die someday, had told us that she recently completed a MOLST at an outside facility. She also had limitations placed on cardiac resuscitation while he was inpatient for us. Of note, I recognize that I did not say that JL himself is nonverbal. JL's mother then shared, following talking about the limitations on cardiac resuscitation, she shared her hope that she has to pursue all medical interventions that will make JL happy and healthy for as long as possible. In seeing JL happy, he's a smiley young man, and watching Harry Potter especially makes him smile. JL's mother also reported a concern at that time for JL being in a lot of pain related to his dystonia, and reflected on the experience where a provider suggested to her that giving JL morphine to go to sleep and eventually die. This brought her a lot of concern. So we've just met JL and his mother, and in addition to hearing the hopes that he lives as long as possible, we've also began to develop this longitudinal relationship. We've developed some familiarity. We now know that JL is able to smile and does so very frequently whenever Harry Potter is mentioned even. We also know that Mom's starting to open up as far as her trust for our team. She's confiding in us her worries about being overly sedated with medication. So we continue this as our relationship develops. So we made a lot of progress in this one moment. It isn't that we just kind of came in and slid up the gradual slope, but it was a solid point of intervention that occurred there. So I made this very lovely change to the graph to suggest that there are points of intervention throughout our care for patients that may be larger, more impactful, maybe occurring at earlier times or later times. And again, it's not always this straight line. Going ahead, we ended up working with JL and doing some team coordination. As time went on and we developed our relationship with JL, we recognized that he was having a lot of recurrent admissions, usually for the same thing, a lot of dystonia, and they became very concerning. The pediatric palliative care team began supporting the distress that Mom was feeling. She was having a lot of unease about a lot of different things. We provided frequent phone calls, and we discussed plans that were usually established by other teams and went through them. There was also some limited communication between those teams and both the family, but also between each other. So at that point, the PD palliative care team really encouraged a meeting to be scheduled. So that way we could really discuss these goals that we had figured out quite some time ago and realign on things. Teams first met amongst themselves and then with JL's mother. And we developed a new plan for symptom management in hopes of avoiding further admissions. Although there was a time between this initial consult here and the actual arranging of a team meeting and getting together and coordinating everything, the intervention that we ended up being able to do there opened the lines of communication that had more or less been closed between both JL's family and teams, as well as even somewhat ours. This had been almost a year since we had seen JL originally. So we made another point. And I want to notice the gap between, because that was a low time as far as the activity that we were involved actively with the family, but again, we made another impact. JL symptom management. Things started to continue as far as his dystonia and pain. And JL's mother told the palliative care team that on that very first meeting that we're still holding on to this idea that there's concern about oversedation with medication. This is something that we heard the first time, we made note of, we continued to keep that in mind, and we carried with us. And as we started to work with symptom management, we really had to have this in mind as we were caring for JL and his mother. Another story was revealed that JL had experienced a medical error in the past, which brought a lot of anxiety to even more medication options. Just thus complicating things a little bit, but also reminding us that we had to continue to keep our communication open. We, at some point, recognized that the multiple teams that were helping out with the symptom management may have been resulting in some of JL mothers' confusion and anxiety. And so we worked together to decide that we would kind of take over a lot of the symptom management. We offered gabapentin. Mother was concerned about gabapentin, but she really found good result with pregabalin. Because of our team's longitudinal knowledge of JL's medical history and this understanding of the concern over medication errors, we were able to anticipate conversations that needed to be had prior to discharge. We were able to talk about, yes, we're on a medication that might have been concerning at one point, but we've been doing very well. And we believe that this is, very much in check. We were able to even set up some care plans for her that were very easily read and understood and followed. So again, we go back, spend some time, but we've made some more progress with JL. Now at this time, we're still working with JL, and we are trying to help mom as far as finding some respite care. JL has been in and out of the hospital pretty frequently, and in doing so mom has been in the hospital with him almost completely. At home, mom is the caregiver all by herself, more or less. He did have a lot of nursing hours at one point. However, being in the hospital, he's lost a lot of the nurses that were filling those hours. So as we thought about respite care, one of the questions that came up was from mom and her question of who's going to take care of him when I can't. And this is something I'm guessing maybe more in adults we get, but we in pediatrics, we don't kind of think that way all the time because our patients are usually younger and therefore their parents are younger. There's no point of who's going to take care of him when I'm gone. However, here it was a concern for mom, obviously. So one of the ideas about respite was to help introduce JL and his mother to the idea of a skilled nursing facility. And this is actually a work in progress right now. Our pediatric palliative care social workers are currently communicating with JL's assigned school for assistance in assessing his developmental age in order to complete some paperwork. And the interventions continue. So as we look at this, we've added another point of intervention. And while time moves on, it suggests that maybe we're getting closer to end of life, but at this point, there's no obvious change in that. So while we have that there and time is moving on, there are limitations to this model in that way. So just want to do a quick recap. The reason that longitudinal and developing longitudinal relationships are so important is because around 70% of pediatric palliative care consults, our patients that are consulted, are still living a year after the consult. Longer relationships afford palliative care providers to develop more trust, more familiarity, and respect with patients and families, which remove the barriers to communication that might occur later. The traditional palliative care model is not really designed to encourage longitudinal relationships, and the new palliative care model advocates for a more longitudinal approach to palliative care. So I want to return to the model that explains how we utilize, we jump in with different families and address the applications over time with them and jump here. And I think looking at this, I know what you're all thinking. It's, again, I'm not a CAD. So I'm very fortunate though that there is a model for pediatric palliative care that exists already and is much more clean than mine. This is the model of pediatric palliative care that sort of does it all. The care here is blended. So as we were talking about jumping in and working with the teams, and there's no solid line between what's palliative care and what's curative care. Additionally, this allows for the interventions to occur not only simultaneously, but cohesively, working together as a group, interdisciplinary team. There's no restriction on a point of entry, so therefore a palliative care provider can come in at any point, which encourages developing relationships over time and addressing any needs collaboratively. The bottom and the top here offers the space to hold seemingly conflicting hopes at the same time. And the hopes continue beyond the beginning of end-of-life care, as well as after death and into bereavement. Finally, there is an emphasis on continuous reevaluation and adjustment, which may be protective against the unexpected. And again, I know what you're thinking this time. Much better looking than the one that I drew myself. This model is somewhat of a comprehensive way of considering longitudinal relationships that, or at least the way I think of it. I think of it as a place that I can jump in at any time when the consultation happens and continue to work with families and not need to worry about where they are as far as their curative or life-prolonging treatments. However, there are still times when even this model kind of gets turned on its head. And so I'd like to talk to you guys a little bit about when terminal extubation isn't terminal. This is the story of MN. MN was a 5-month-old, otherwise healthy infant. He was transferred to Boston Children's Emergency Department from an outside hospital. And earlier that day, he had been found unresponsive. MN and his father had been napping together when MN's father woke up and found MN at the edge of the mattress, cyanotic, and like I said, unresponsive. Chest compressions were completed at an outside hospital, and circulation was returned prior to transfer to Boston Children's. At Boston Children's, an MRI was conducted, and it showed extensive global hypoxic ischemic injury with superimposed areas of subdural hemorrhages. The neurology team shared with the family that a poor prognosis was expected, and after a second opinion and further discussion, the team identified that extubation at home was the family's goal. So palliative transportation was offered. At this point is then where the pediatric palliative care team was consulted. Unfortunately, the time of this consult obstructed, again, any effort for the team to establish kind of a longitudinal relationship. It's more of an acute interaction. So it's almost as though the traditional model returned. So at that point, pediatric palliative care consulted to assist specifically with palliative transport. The team went in and reviewed the goals and context of palliative transportation and confirmed that yes, in fact, MN's family wanted him to go home and were exceptionally invested in having their friends, their family at their home, spending time in their yard next to their fire pit with their loved ones as MN passed away. So as a hospital referral was made with the plan to return home, and transportation was arranged as well. MN was extubated at home. Palliative care team went with and completed the extubation. It wasn't unexpected, but MN did breathe without any assistance. He was triggering the vent already, and it was already discussed with the family that this would likely happen. Palliative care team then provided the family and arranged for emergency medications and set up the family with very, very close hospice support, as well as our own team supporting the hospice employees. Fast forward to for a few days later, I myself was on call and I received a page in the afternoon to return a call to the hospice team. I knew this page was about MN, and so I went to my idea of, okay, here's where we are in our trajectory. Here's what we have. We're at end of life care. So in preparation for the phone call, I started thinking through my own head and discuss about maybe this call is going to be about medication adjustments, what might be necessary there. Perhaps MN has died, and we're going to start talking about bereavement and other follow-up that way. When I spoke to the hospice team, the team reported that the parents felt that MN had become more interactive and engaging. Mom was very eager to increase feeds. She was very focused on feeds prior to discharge, and we had sent them home with very, very small amount of feeds to provide some nutrition. However, as she saw and the family saw more engaging and more interaction, they wanted to continue to increase the feeds. However, every time they increased the feeds, he was showing a lot of discomfort. So receiving this call and considering, oh, we're at end of life when I answer the phone, then I look and I say, well, where are we now? How do I move from, I've already moved past this. How do I move back? What's the role here? And being a relatively young fellow at that time, I definitely looked to the attendings and the core team, the nurse practitioner, to show me how that's done, how to kind of stay nimble in that moment. With the conversation that we were having with hospice, there was some understandable mistrust that the family was feeling with the teams that had sent their son home in their minds. They were somewhat reluctant and obviously saddened by the idea of going home for extubation. And now that they see him as doing so well, they're wondering if this trust can continue. And as we started to discuss, neither PACT, the palliative care team, or hospice were able to really re-engage conversation about the overall change in plan. But really all that the family wanted was a conversation about how to increase feeding. Going to go tangential here and talk a little bit about REGOAUNG and give a brief introduction here. REGOAUNG is a conceptual model offered in 2014 by Dr. Feutner, used to kind of describe patients' and families' decisions to adjust their clinical goals. The definition of REGOAUNG itself is the process over time of disengaging with one set of goals and re-engaging or adopting a new set of goals. Usually what is the catalyst for this is some sort of external force, an unexpected acute illness, unsuccessful goal-directed care. The article has a focus on the idea of this occurring as families decide to more remove maybe medical care and focus more on comfort. However, in this case, I would have to say that this family had REGOAUNG. It was maybe the opposite of how it's been explained in the past, but this family held on to a goal of comfort at death at home, and instead adopted a new goal, the goal of feeding, providing nutrition, and then also pursuing an alternative therapy. So, as I explained a little bit before, there was some mistrust that was there, and there was only conversation around this idea of nutrition. So in order to re-engage with the family and through hospice, the palliative care team was able to coordinate with the primary care provider who still had their connection, and then eventually reconnecting the family with nutrition. We explained our concerns about refeeding syndrome and about the discomfort being felt by MN, and family was still reluctant to be seen at all in a hospital, but was willing to come in for an urgent outpatient. Nutrition was able to recommend that they agree with trying to start feeds, but that it would not be safe at home. And therefore, the family had decided that, okay, it was okay that they were admitted back to the hospital. And in the hospital, palliative care team had a chance to revisit some of their goals. And in revisiting their goals, the family had shared with us that they were very hopeful to go out of town, out of state for a hyperbaric treatment. This caused some distress around the teams. This is a treatment that does not have much evidence for this exact diagnosis, as well as it's an out-of-pocket cost. However, at this moment in time, although we never really overly encouraged them, our team was still able to recognize that this was crucial in realigning with them. And we also assisted other teams in doing so as well. This idea of the mistrust that was there before and the limited interaction relationship that we had prior to the end-of-life care that we offered had kind of stifled any ability to develop a relationship. And this point was an opportunity to develop a relationship. So the family did go ahead and were able to go to out of state again for this treatment, and PACT made sure that they remained in contact with them. And we started, once again, to develop a longitudinal relationship. And at this point, we are continuing to supply prescriptions and treat symptoms for MN. We also provide some supportive counseling for the family. And actually, 5-month-old MN, at the beginning of this story, he will be 1 month at the end of, or 1 year old at the end of this month. Despite this rather acute start, the palliative care team has developed quite the longitudinal relationship with MN and his family. And what's amazing about this is this idea of re-goaling that came in kind of shifted everything and allowed us to start this longitudinal relationship, or really continue this longitudinal relationship. And we expect it to be ongoing throughout his life. So the unexpected beauty.
My dessert is a deconstructed apple tartlet with candy walnut crumble, apple brandy cream, persimmon chips.
Looks kind of good. It's kind of what happened with MN. We completely deconstructed this whole idea of how a timeline works, where we get involved. We talk about how, honestly, we first came in with goals of care discussion and palliative care transportation, all in the setting of this idea of end-of-life care. The family, meanwhile, at the bottom, really held on for this hope for comfort, but also this hope for cure. They had this hope for meaning, and they also had this hope for miracle. Put this point of re-goaling, this change of, this disengagement of the idea that comfort is the most important thing right now for our child, and to kind of show that it slows down a little bit and it goes back on to this idea of a longitudinal, similar to the longitudinal models that were shown earlier. Worked with symptom management, feeding goals, team coordination, team distress, and currently are continuously reevaluating and making adjustments, hopefully with the goal of avoiding any future unexpected re-goaling. So we spoke a little bit about how we want to recognize longitudinal relationships and their points in pediatric palliative care. And we reviewed the different ways that we do interact with families over a partnership. And then we kind of talked briefly about the idea of re-goaling and how re-goaling can be a continual part of a relationship with families, and it can also sometimes be a somewhat acute event that maybe even allows us to think of our relationship in a new way.
It's fragrant, it's delicious.
Thank you.
You know, to be that bold and that tenacious, to deconstruct something, you need to know at the other end it's as good as the original. And it definitely is. I mean, seriously, well done.
So we deconstructed our model, and it ended up working for this family as good as the original. Lots of thank yous to every person in the room for joining me today and those listening. Special thank yous to those that helped me set up my slide decks and review things: Marcia, Jenna, Christy, Jennifer, Rachel, Emma, Suni, and Kate Renee. Also, always a shout out to the PACT fellows, Zena, Lauren, and Pooja, who helped me get through all of this and have done the majority of the work for these patients, I would say. And of course, the rest of the Harvard Interprofessional Palliative Care co-fellows, as well as the PACT team. A very special thank you to JL and MN and their families, as they have been, I think, it's just been such an amazing privilege to work with these two families in particular, and I think all of us have been able to learn so much from them, and I hope we've helped them at least somewhat. And just really thank you to all the patients and families with whom we've had the privilege to work. Questions?
Thank you, Pete. I wonder if there are questions here.
Thank you, Pete. I think like you're highlighting something that's really important for us as a field to understand. And I guess we're doing a lot of thinking about this in the adult space, that part of what we need to do to move the field forward is to understand psychologically what's happening. And I guess one thing that this is going to be more a comment like for us to think about. I don't think this is about time. I think it's only partially about time, right? So there are all these factors that I think psychologically, what you did in that first situation with JL is provide a safe holding environment that allowed the patient and family to have some other desire other than just living longer. And that actually is time, it's trust, it's skill, it's expertise, it's allowing them to have this dual framework that we talk about, that they can look at both things. And it's interesting because in the second case, we're used to coming in and very quickly building rapport and changing goals of care, but it's not just a rapport bank. It's all of these other things. And I guess I would challenge us to say, I think that's just good palliative care, like the second case. Our job is to be partnered and to figure out where that patient and family is and be connected with them and build that safe holding environment, because at some point this child is unfortunately not going to have a good outcome, whether that's now or whether that's in a year and a half. And so I think we need to push ourselves to do what you're doing today and to think about what are all the factors that need to be in place for this family to look at both things again. In a way. And so I applaud you for helping us think about it. And I think we have to push it and be even clearer from our educational goals and our research goals.
Right. Excellent. Yeah, I think, again, I think that this was, I assume more usual on the adult side of the quick meet, rapport, and kind of talk about end of life and work with that than we do often in pediatric side. And I also recognize that we're going to have this long relationship with this family now. And so there's going to be, we're going to rebuild that trust, and we're going to have to figure out how we can provide them that space.
Thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sharon Levine, the new Section Chief of Geriatrics, and this is as much a part of our lives, first slide, JL anyway, in the geriatric version. And one of the questions that I would ask you, in looking at your longitudinal model, and especially in relation to trust, is where are the PCPs and all of this? Where are the people who know this person and who have relationships with the families as well as the patients? Even for the second patient, MN, this person came from an outside hospital, presumably had a PCP because that person was involved in the plan afterwards. And I think that co-management of these patients is really, you had the thumbprints through that longitudinal care, but one could imagine that that's really part of the deconstructed and blended kind of care.
Absolutely. And I definitely did not give, especially JL's PCP, enough credit. They've been incredibly helpful, organizing things, helping prescribe, helping kind of keep that going. With the MN, I don't know that until there was, I think the idea was this is end of life. And so there was probably a phone call said, going home on hospice to let you know, and this is a sad story. But it wasn't until, oh, wait, things are different now, that then was re-engaging with them. So yeah, that's a great point.
I want to see if there are any questions at Dana-Farber.
How is MN doing now? Is he in a PVS, or is he even beyond that?
I think there was so it's interesting because at 5 months old, when there's an injury, you still have developmental to do. So there was no way to know how much MN would develop in general. But he has had some developmental achievements, not necessarily aligned with his milestones. He most recently, we actually received a message from MN's mother asking us something along the lines of, I think my son has CP. Who gives him that diagnosis? So there was some areas of miscommunication, I think, or maybe opportunities that were not there, but there's obviously this realization that the achievements that were made, especially in the time of the hyperbaric treatment, may not be enough to continue forward to keep on developing in that path.
Is it right to say that he was engaging with his mother? Because that's high level from what they're telling.
Mom felt that he was engaging with him, definitely.
You know, in this book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down, Leah Lee has a prolonged arrest and is in a PVS and she died in her 40s.
Yeah.
And a dirty secret is PVS generally can swallow by themselves, and she was simply fed by all her siblings.
Yeah.
Does MN still have? How's he fed now?
I believe he still has a NG tube at this point. I don't think they've actually gone for a G tube yet, but I believe he still has an NG tube. I think that they have cleared him for thicker feeding, but I think the last time I saw, he was able to take about an ounce at a time for PO.
All right. Thank you so much, Peter, for helping us to think about this in a different way. Thank you.
Thank you.